By now we hear that inflammation is very, very important, right? We know that we need to be paying attention to it. But the reality is we need to take a step closer to the actual science. We are all about making sure that we don't just level up our customers, but we level up the public when it comes down to understanding inflammation. And it's not just so that we can sell more of our anti-inflammatory turmeric. It's so that we can be seen as thought leaders in science and in overall education. So let's go ahead and dive in to the top 5 causes of inflammation. All right, let's go ahead and get down to it. First, we have to address what inflammation is in a little bit more of an in-depth way than I normally would. Normally, I'll just talk about it being kind of the simple healing response, but this warrants a little bit more of an explanation. You see, inflammation is a response that does help you heal, but it is a good thing. And the simplest way to explain it is to use a simple example of like twisting your knee or bumping your elbow. See what's gonna happen, let's say you go on a hike and you twist your knee. Okay, you're gonna notice it gets swollen, right? Well, that process is literally just blood plasma leaking into that area so that more proteins can come to the area to heal it. Okay, it's a good thing, but it goes through a natural cycle. So you have inflammation that occurs first, and it's there to protect the joint and to deliver a massive amount of fluid and white blood cells and everything to heal something. Very important process. Then in the recovery process, that inflammation starts to subside because the proteins have done its job. And then before the process is done, you have one last little surge of inflammation, which is basically cytokines coming through to make sure that the job is done right. So it goes like this. You have sentinel cells that go out and discover that there's an injury. Those sentinel cells basically trigger more blood flow and a leakage of blood plasma to that area. So lots of proteins, lots of macrophages, lots of white blood cells go to that area to heal it. Okay, then of course you have the actual healing process, and then you have the last batch of cytokines that come in and check off the box. Those last batch of cytokines are kind of like the discharge doctor at a hospital. It's like they have to sign off before the deal is actually done and the patient can go home. That's exactly what's happening with inflammation at an acute level. Now I want you to imagine this. Imagine you have 1 million bruised elbows going on inside your body at all times. Okay, it's like you have this injury that you can relate to, but I want you to imagine it happening at the cellular level inside your body all the time. Now imagine how draining that is. You know how painful and draining it is when you have an injury on your arm or your knee, right? Okay, now imagine it happening at the cellular level where you don't really have pain receptors. You just have this constant nag. Okay, that is inflammation, and you can now hopefully understand how terrible it can be for you. So let's take a look at the top 5 causes of inflammation. I'm going to start with number 1, which is simple, but it's the diet. But it's not just any ordinary diet. It's one specific thing that I want you to focus on. It's not one particular food or anything like that. It's something known as advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. What advanced glycation end products are basically the non-enzymatic breakdown of protein and sugars and sometimes lipids. You see, when we consume foods, we have enzymatic breakdowns, which is like pancreatic lipase and things like that that are breaking down foods. But then we have non-enzymatic breakdowns, which are literally just the denaturing and the just overall demolition of these sugars, these proteins, and these fats. Some of it's natural, some of it's not. But the reality is, it's not always a good thing. And when we're constantly heating foods to a high degree, like with processed foods, we are increasing the amount of these advanced glycation end products dramatically. These AGEs trigger inflammation in multiple ways. You see, when sugar reacts with proteins and lipids, it basically creates this response that ends up trapping proteins, for lack of a better way of saying it. Basically, it traps these proteins and it keeps them in one area. And when that happens, you have a massive increase in white blood cells. Now, I want you to imagine, you're eating food. These glycation end products are traveling around throughout your entire body, trapping proteins throughout your entire body. Okay, that trapping of proteins throughout your entire body is triggering a low-grade white blood cell immune response throughout your entire body. So you might be wondering, okay, well, this is kind of vague. Processed foods, yeah, they're not good. What can I do? The simplest thing is cooking foods at a lower heat whenever possible. Avoid combining sugars and proteins and sugars and fats whenever possible. But also try to opt for the foods that are at least flash frozen. So a lot of the processed foods are heated to a certain degree where it denatures the proteins, and then they're heated again, and then they add starches, and then they add these other molecules, and then they add all these different hydrogenated things where they're heating it again. It's the constant heating and denaturing of proteins that's creating these glycation end products. So go to the frozen food section and get things that are flash frozen. Okay, it's not a bad thing to get frozen food. I know we're all human. Okay, but just avoid the processed garbage, the Snickers, the stuff like that. Again, vague, but very true. Next up is decreasing the size of your fat cells. Okay, that's kind of funny. Like, how am I going to do that? Well, the simple thing is losing some body fat. Because believe it or not, body fat and fat in general is one of the biggest drivers of inflammation in our bodies, because it starts this feedback system that just ends up compounding on top of each other, on top of each other. And it's terrible. You see, fat cells secrete hormones, and these hormones actually bind to themselves. It's a pretty interesting process. But here's what happens. Normally, we have pro-inflammatory hormones and anti-inflammatory hormones that are secreted by one fat cell. Usually it's in balance. It's not triggering inflammation, it's just enough healthy fat just to get the job done. But the problem is we don't multiply fat cells a whole lot, we usually just grow the individual ones. And when we grow those individual ones, they become bloated. And when a fat cell becomes bloated or engorged, it secretes too much of the wrong hormone. It secretes the pro-inflammatory hormone. So therefore increases what is called WNT5. That's the pro-inflammatory hormone, which therefore upregulates something known as JNK1. These numbers don't really matter, but basically this upregulation of JNK1 is triggering a bunch of white blood cells, macrophages, and interleukins, all these inflammatory components, to the site of that fat cell, where it gets picked up by the bloodstream and travels throughout the rest of the body. This upregulation of JNK1 also triggers insulin resistance. So basically what's happening is the fat cells and the cells in general are now becoming resistant to insulin, which means you have higher degrees of blood sugar floating around, which causes more cellular damage and more organ damage. So basically the immune system goes on overdrive and it starts attacking everything it can because it doesn't know what the heck it's really supposed to be doing. This is how you end up with issues. So the leaner you are to a certain degree, you can combat inflammation. Number 3 is gut health. There are a lot of things that are destroying our gut health, but when you understand what's happening at the gut level, things start to make a little bit more sense. So as the good bacteria in your gut starts to go away and the bad bacteria, the gram-negative bacteria, starts to increase, you have an increase in what are called lipopolysaccharides. Okay, these lipopolysaccharides are basically intestinal toxins. And these lipopolysaccharides get picked up by what are called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons are there to deliver fat from the intestinal tract into the body so they can get utilized. So fat hitches a ride on chylomicrons for digestive purposes. It's very important, very good thing. Chylomicrons are good. The problem is the lipopolysaccharides also hitch a ride on the chylomicrons. So the more unhealthy our gut is, the more our chylomicrons are also taking this hijacker along with them. Normally the chylomicrons can take the hijacker, the lipopolysaccharide, to the liver and the liver can handle it. But when this starts happening to an advanced degree, the liver can't really handle it anymore. So what happens is you're left with all these lipopolysaccharides in the bloodstream not getting processed by the liver, which therefore triggers the white blood cells to react with them. Therefore, hence inflammation. So we have to take control of our gut health, and the best way that you can do that is, of course, consuming the right prebiotic fibers, the right probiotics, but also making sure that you're not consuming a bunch of artificial sweeteners that are killing off your gut bacteria, and making sure that you're managing stress the best that you can. Speaking of stress, it kind of leads me into number 4, controlling chronic stress. Easier said than done, right? I mean, but the reality is, if you know how this process works, it's at the very least interesting information, okay? So when we're stressed, we have a response of adrenaline and noradrenaline, and therefore a little bit of cortisol. Noradrenaline and cortisol kind of work hand in hand. They feed with each other. Now, when we're stressed, we have that response and it's all good, and eventually we come back to life. But the reality is when we get chronically stressed, we start adapting to that stress. Now, that adaptation to stress might feel like a good thing to our brains because we're like, hey, I'm just used to operating this high level of stress. It's all good. But the reality is your body isn't adjusted to that. Your brain is coping with it because we are hyper-intelligent individuals with very active prefrontal cortexes that can convince ourselves to be okay in a stressful situation. However, that prefrontal cortex doesn't necessarily supersede what's happening at the cellular level. So what ends up happening is your noradrenaline and cortisol levels are still rising and rising and rising and rising, even though your brain is adapted to it. So your brain's being like, it's all cool, guys, we're good, you're good, but the body is still reacting crazily with a bunch of stress. That is exactly why stress has been dubbed the silent killer, because we don't realize what it's doing at an inflammatory level. So the best way that you can combat that is just do what you can to combat stress. But I'll be honest and say, like, it's really hard. You can't just control it all the time. You have all these external factors. But again, knowing it helps a little bit just in that. Next up is going to be sleep. And this is going to upset a lot of people because you're like, okay, Thomas, like, I just can't do it. I can't get 7 or 8 hours of sleep. But what if I told you that actually sleeping more than 7 hours or more than 8 hours is actually detrimental too? You see, we do need to find ourselves in that sweet spot of about 7 hours. And what happens if we don't is we have something known as the glymphatic system. The glymphatic system is basically the system within our brain that allows cerebrospinal fluid to do its job. So basically you have cells inside that cerebrospinal fluid that expand and contract. Well, when we're stressed out or we're not sleeping, those cells don't really contract, they just stay expanded, which means that they're not able to absorb toxins. They're not able to absorb what's called the beta amyloid plaque. Alzheimer's disease is largely attributed to a production or a massive amount of beta amyloid plaque. To a smaller degree, stress and not being able to think clearly is also associated with influxes of beta amyloid plaque. So if the cerebrospinal fluid doesn't have the cellular capacity to absorb that beta amyloid plaque, it can't flush it out and it's stuck in our brain, therefore leading to brain fog. So inflammation at its core, we're feeling it when we feel foggy, when our brain just isn't working really well. So you combine all these things and you're looking at a serious, serious issue. And almost every single disease has been linked to inflammation. So take it or leave it. You can implement changes to help your life and live a better lifestyle. And honestly, that's going to help. But one of the things that you also can do is utilize a good quality turmeric that is going to at least help control some of the inflammation that is just a part of daily life. I honestly believe that we're never going to be able to combat all the inflammation out there, and we're not going to be able to live this perfectly squeaky clean life. But at least with some liposomal micellar turmeric, you can at least get through the day with a little bit more ease. I'll see you soon.